Hi, Donovan here. Welcome back to Independent Audiobook Creation. This is going to be episode 2, Basic Terminology. What I'm going to do in this episode is go over a few basic terms, the way that they're used either in the software that I'm going to be using to help create my audiobook and step you through the process, or are used by the Audiobook Creation Exchange, ACX, through Audible.
One thing I did want to note real quick is that the terminology I'm going to go over in this video is kind of aimed at the writer, a person who hasn't really had any exposure to any of these concepts before, and so I'm not going to get super technical about most of these definitions. I'm not a sound engineer, so what I'm trying to do is describe the concepts that I'm going to use here in a way that makes it sort of easy to understand, so that we kind of just get enough information about what we're doing that we can get through the process of editing and filtering the software to meet the technical standards for ACX without overburdening the author, a writer who most of the time is writing, not doing this professionally for sound. Just enough understanding so that we can make that work the best way that we can. In any event, just a basic introduction to the terms, so let's get started.
First up, we're going to discuss is the difference between mono and stereo. This is probably pretty straightforward, but I want to make sure that there's one thing in particular about how ACX handles audio files that you should definitely be aware of. Mono versus stereo describes the number of channels that are used in the playback or in the recording, could be in the recording. What we're talking specifically here about is the playback format itself. They prefer for them to be mono files instead of stereo files. You can submit stereo files when you submit it. So if you have a stereo microphone, or if the recording software that you use defaults to recording in stereo mode, even if the microphone is a mono mic, you can certainly submit those stereo files. What you can't do, according to ACX, is submit what's known as joint stereo. The best thing to do is to make that kind of the last step before you save the file, or as you're saving the file for the final time before submission, is to make sure that it's in mono format. Mono format is your best bet. Next up are bitrate, format, and sampling rate. Bitrate describes the number of bits per second that can be transmitted. In the case of an MP3 file, which is the kind of file that you'll be submitting later to the ACX, the minimum bit rate of 192 kilobits per second means that for every second of time that passes, the audio file will send at least 192,000 bits of audio. Next is format. In this context, format means the file kind that is being submitted to ACX, and that, of course, is MP3. But what it describes is both the actual format of the file as well as some of the compression that's used, and it has to do with the output being compressed in terms of its file size. Compression is a weird concept in sound and in bits in terms of computer technology, because they're not the same. They use the same word for two different sort of concepts. They're kind of related, and it has to do with how squished something is. It has to do with the file sizes, and an MP3 format is what's known as a lossy format, which means you're going to lose some of the original sound when it is compressed into the MP3 format. There are other formats that are lossless, meaning that they don't have or create any loss of the original audio, or more generally, they don't result in a loss of any information. Finally, we have sampling rate. And this has to do with how many times per second the sound that's coming into the microphone, or whatever the audio capture device is, how many times per second that audio is being sampled, i.e. how many times per second it's being listened to, in essence. The standard for sampling rate for most audio, especially vocal creation, is 44.1 kilohertz. And again, kilohertz is thousands of times per second. That's kind of what hertz means. And so essentially, again, that's the number of discrete times per second that sound will be recorded and can be played back. And so they're recorded and played back at the same speed. Next, we describe the room tone, head, and tail as they relate to ACX files. Room tone describes the background noise of the room as it's being recorded. ACX makes a requirement that every file that you submit have a head, which is the beginning of the audio file itself, have at least 0.5 and no more than 1 second of room tone. That is to say, the surrounding sound of the room itself. For ACX, you want the room tone to be as close to silence as possible. Definitely don't want for it to have any extraneous noises, which we'll talk about in a second. And you want that noise floor, which we'll also talk about in a second, to be as low as possible. Also in the room tone, not just during the recording itself. Head is the beginning of the file, and tail is the end of the file, at least in this context. In the head, ACX requires that there be at least 0.5 and no more than 1.0 seconds of room tone at the beginning, and at the tail, they want at least 1.0 seconds and no more than 5.0 seconds of room tone also at the end of the file, or the tail, so that the listener has a cue about where they are, and the fact that the previous part has ended and the new part is about to begin. When you do your narration, of course, a little later, every section should be narrated. You should narrate the beginning of the section. After that 0.5 to 1 seconds of room tone is finished, you'll start narrating and give them a sense for what the section is, give it the title, and then read the section or chapter that's coming up. Now we talk about extraneous sounds. Extraneous sounds for ACX are really kind of basically any sound other than the narration itself. And this would include things like coughing or cats inside the house. Or if you're in a studio, it might include things like an ungrounded air conditioning system that's making a hum in the stereo or in the microphone. If you are doing some home recording, it could be the passing of a motorcycle on the street outside the house, lip smacking, breathing. There are two other ones that are in particular that can be very troublesome for sound recording, and those are pops and plosives. And as you probably heard, when I said pop, you heard that there was a little burst of air. That's called a plosive, oddly enough. A plosive has to do with the expelling of air during certain sounds that human beings make during speech. There is a technical definition for it, and if I were a speech language pathologist, I could probably give you a better technical definition. There are some ways that we can deal with that. One of those is to use a pop filter. For certain microphones, if you have to sit real close to it in order to make it work the best, then having a pop filter in front of it will help to eliminate pops and plosives. If you don't have a pop filter, they can be seemingly a lot more expensive than they ought to be for what they are. It's basically just a mesh filter in a device that can be attached to a microphone. And I've seen them, even really just super basic ones, in the stores that can cost $20-30, which doesn't make any sense to me. It's a piece of wire, a screw, and some mesh that's contained in another screw, whatever. There are some ways to mitigate it if you don't have a pop filter. One of those ways is going to be sit back a little bit farther from the microphone, project a little more, give yourself a little more voice support and project your voice. Another way to help eliminate that is to do what's called off-axis, a little bit of off-axis narration. And what that means, of course, is that there's a cone of there's a cone of sound, especially for shotgun type microphones, that where where they will pick up sound preferentially. And in that cone, you can speak toward the microphone or speak just a little bit away from it. And if you do that last part, if you're not looking straight at the microphone, but are instead turned slightly, or the microphone is turned so that it's still pointing at your mouth, but your mouth is not speaking directly into the microphone in this way, then that off-axis speaking will direct some of those plosives away from the diaphragm directly and will reduce them, even in the absence of a pop filter or other device that will help to prevent that. Finally, the three last terms that we're going to talk about in this context today are RMS, peak, and noise floor. RMS stands for root mean square and essentially describes the overall volume or loudness of a sound file in this case. From a technical perspective, it isn't all that important for an artist who's going to self-record the narration of his or her audiobook. But it is important to recognize that basically what it means is that there's an overall amount of sound. There's a floor, there's a ceiling. We'll talk about those two here in just one second, sort of. And in between those two is where all of the sound is. And there are going to be parts of any audio that are more toward the silent end, and some of it that's more toward the louder end. Okay, that's your top and bottom here. And inside that, there's going to be a sort of a mean of the number of decibels of sound that are being output. And that's essentially what that root mean squared is trying to capture, is how much actual sound. If I talk like this and barely kind of speak in the background and there's not much more than my own speech over the noise, then the root mean squared is going to be lower. But if I actually talk and I have some more loudness to the voice that I'm using, and I project with a little bit more volume, then that's going to bring that root mean squared up. That RMS is the shorthand version of that. And that root mean squared then is going to go higher, because the amount of difference between the bottom and the top is going to go up. And the difference, of course, if you have a passage where there's very little variation between the bottom and the top, then your RMS is going to be easier to adjust up and down, which is a concept that we'll talk about when we get into filtering, which will be not the next video, but the one immediately after that. So anyway, that RMS has to do really with kind of how this total volume is together over the entirety of the sound file. For sound file submissions to ACX, the RMS needs to be between -18 and -23 decibels. I'll show you some ways in not the next video, but the one after this, once we get into the software filtering and editing part of it. I'll show you some ways that we can take that RMS and make it higher, even if you didn't record it at that level. That's okay. We can fix that in post, as they say. That is one of the things that you can fix in post. Peak, if we're looking at that audio waveform, the peak is the top. The peak has to do with how loud the loudest parts of a sound file are. Think of it as mountain peaks. When we're talking, when I'm speaking like this is kind of an overall. It kind of has the same basic. Now the pitch is different. The pitch goes up and down, but the actual volume level of it is not terribly different, because I'm deliberately trying to make exactly the same amount of volume come out of my mouth as I'm speaking. Now, if I wanted to, I could really make a difference. And the peaks, as I'm speaking, these are going to be things. Those are going to be the things that you'll see in the waveform later. They'll be a little louder. They'll be much easier to see, because those peaks are the big spikes that come up in your sound file. The peaks for ACX should never be more than -3 decibels, and this is because there has to be what's called headroom, which is not the same as the head at the beginning of the file. There needs to be headroom at the top because the absolute level of decibel output that can be created for digital sound files is going to be 0 decibels. That's going to be kind of the absolute top. And anything that would go above 0 decibels is going to get clipped or is going to sound distorted inside the mic, inside headphones or on speakers. So we need to keep our decibel peaks below -3. That can be also fairly easily done, and we'll kind of I'll go over some ways to do that in the filtering video. The opposite concept of the peak, sort of, is the noise floor. And the noise floor has to do with how low it gets at the bottom, sort of, kind of. But the noise floor is the absolute bottom level of the background of the other sounds in the room. Now, room tone and noise floor kind of sort of related, but the noise floor has to do with how low your own sound goes and compared to your own volume, and you compare that to the background level of all of the sound that's behind you. And that can actually be reduced. There's software, when we work a little later in the software packages, we're going to be able to take that noise floor and push it down. The noise floor for ACX, for any of your submitted files, has to be no higher than -60 decibels. And that's fairly quiet. -60 decibels is fairly quiet. So the next question is, how do you fix problems? How do you fix problems with these, with some of these? There are some hardware things that you can do to give yourself the best quality sound that you can and make it a little easier later on. One is to have the highest quality microphone that you can afford. Another one is to have a studio where during your recording that has as much silence in the room tone as you can manage. Drink warm liquids to keep your voice supple so that you're not having to strain, which can come out in the final audio product. You're also going to want to, so if you can't create a studio at home, which of course we've all seen music videos of musicians singing in a padded studio, you can do that, of course, if you have the ability to go out and get foam. You can put foam up on the flat surfaces in the room you're going to use to record. You can also use heavy blankets or towels on the wall. When I show you my workspace, you'll see that I actually do some of this. I use for some of my microphone recording when I'm doing simply audio, not just video and audio. I have a pillow and a towel that I wrap right next to the microphone to help kind of keep it in place. But it also helps to absorb sounds so that I'm not getting echo off the walls, off the monitor screen, off the printer that I have in the room, those kinds of things. So those are some other ways. Speak to the microphone as close as you can without popping or plosive noises coming through. If you do have a tendency to do those, and most people will, especially when they're speaking right into the microphone, use a pop filter. That will help a lot. If you don't have a pop filter, we talked a little bit about being off axis. You can have the microphone pointing at your mouth, but have your mouth pointing just off to the side. That way that sound, that burst of air from those plosives doesn't go right into the diaphragm of the microphone. If you have this capability, and if you're using any of the software that I'm showing you, you will. Use a VU meter while you're recording, and don't ever let your voice speaking peaks get into the red. They should never ever go into the red on those VU meters while you're recording. If you keep it in the green with occasional peaks that go up into the yellow, that's okay. In fact, that's exactly what you want, because that means that those peaks are starting to get into that range of about -6 to -3 decibels for your peak noise levels, which is what you want, or for your peak sound levels, which is what you want for ACX submissions, and that'll work out really well for you. So that's the basic introduction, some basic terminology. Hopefully this will help you as we move along into the next step.
The next video that I'm going to do is going to be released in the next couple of days. Will be sort of an overview of the hardware setup that I have, including the computer that I'm using, and some suggestions about where, if you need to do something with a different kind of a computer, things that you can do yourself, as well as the actual audio setup that I'm using inside the inside my home office studio here. So hopefully you'll stick around, watch the next video. Hopefully you learned something today, and hopefully we'll continue to get your process of creating your audiobook on the road to success. Thanks, and I'll see you in the next video.